In the middle of a bay stands a ship. It does not move. It never has, and it never will, because it is made of concrete. Wait, a concrete ship? In the open bay? One that hasn't sunk for over 100 years? Yes, and this is not science fiction. It is a real structure that American engineers built where, it would seem, it was fundamentally impossible. Fort Drum, the concrete battleship. One of the most unusual military installations to ever exist on this planet, and it is still standing there today. Today, we're going to break this story down piece by piece. How it was built, why, what's inside, and what happened to this fort during the years when the entire Pacific Ocean was engulfed in war. Stay with us. The most interesting part is just beginning. But first, let's figure out why anyone would think to build a battleship that doesn't go anywhere. Imagine a map of the world. Find the Pacific Ocean. Now shift your gaze to the west, to where the ocean narrows between islands. The Philippines, an archipelago of 7,000 islands. And in the very heart of this archipelago lies Manila Bay. It's not just a beautiful spot on the map. Manila Bay is a gateway. Whoever controls the entrance to the bay controls Manila. And whoever controls Manila controls the entire region. This was true in the 16th century when the Spanish arrived. It was true in the 19th. And at the beginning of the 20th, it was true as well. The Spanish understood this perfectly. That is why they had been building forts here since the 1500s. Stone, limestone, thick walls. By the standards of their time, these were serious fortifications. They stood on tiny islands right at the mouth of the bay, like corks in a bottle. No ship could enter or leave without their knowledge. But then, the Americans came. The Spanish-American War. It ended quickly. The Spanish fleet was crushed in Manila Bay in a matter of hours. The Philippines passed into U.S. control. And the new masters of the archipelago immediately asked themselves, how are we going to defend what we just gained? The old Spanish forts were no good. Not at all. New ships, new guns, new firing ranges. Everything had changed. A completely different defense system was needed. American military engineers arrived in the bay and began studying the terrain. The islands, the depths, the currents, the firing angles. They worked methodically, meticulously, like architects before building a skyscraper. And that was when they stumbled upon something interesting. A tiny islet in the southern part of the bay, almost unnoticeable. It was called El Fraile, the friar in Spanish, a rock jutting out of the water. No vegetation, no buildings, just a piece of stone about 100 meters long. But its location was perfect. Engineers looked at the map and realized, any ship heading for Manila passes this rock within point-blank range. Every single one, no exceptions. It was a point that could not be bypassed. The only question was, what to do with it? And it was here that one of the engineers proposed an idea that his colleagues initially took for a joke. The idea was simple. So simple it seemed absurd. Why build a fort on an island when you can turn the island itself into a fort? Not just build walls around the perimeter of the rock, not just place guns on the shore, but completely reshape the island. Pour it with concrete. Give it a form. Turn a piece of natural stone into a war machine with decks, turrets, armored walls, and guns, just like a real warship. Only this ship would never move an inch. The U.S. War Department approved the project in 1909, and it immediately became clear this would not be fast, it would not be cheap, and it would not be easy. Imagine the scale of the task. A small rocky island in the middle of the bay. No infrastructure, no fresh water, no housing for workers. Everything, absolutely everything, had to be delivered on barges. Cement, rebar, tools, food, fresh water. Every single day, for years. The workers lived right on the island in temporary barracks. Tropical heat, humidity at 90%, the rainy season, which turns everything around into a solid wall of water. And they built. First, the foundation. The rock was literally shaved down, leveled, and the first layers of concrete were poured. Then the walls began to rise. Not ordinary walls. Monolithic concrete blocks ranging from 3 to 11 meters thick in the most critical areas. 11 meters of concrete. Stand up and count 11 steps from your wall. That was the thickness of this ship's hull. From the outside, the fort was taking on more distinct features. A flattened hull, a blocky superstructure in the center, two massive turrets, bow and stern. Looking from the water, the silhouette strangely resembled a squat river monitor or a turn-of-the-century battleship, except it was stationary, and clearly in no hurry to go anywhere. The length of the finished structure was about 100 meters. The width, 43 meters. The height of the superstructure above the waterline, about 12 meters. This wasn't a small fort on a rock. This was a real warship, only made of concrete, and permanently fused into the floor of the bay. Construction lasted from 1909 to 1919, 10 years. During this time, the world managed to live through the First World War, while the fort just kept being built, methodically, layer by layer. When the blueprints for the final version reached a group of naval engineers for review, several people initially thought they were looking at a student project. Too unusual, too bold, too unlike anything that had been built before. But it wasn't a student project. It was a functional fortress, and it was almost ready to get its teeth. Have you ever seen the gun turret of a real battleship in person? If so, you know the feeling. When you stand next to it and realize this thing is larger than your apartment, that a single shell from this barrel weighs as much as a small car, that the sound of the shot can be heard for dozens of kilometers. Those were the exact kind of turrets installed on Fort Drum. 2 gun turrets, bow and stern, exactly like a combat ship. Each held 2 14-inch guns. That's 356 millimeters. For a sense of scale, a grown man can easily crawl into that barrel. The same guns were mounted on American battleships of that era, one and the same. This wasn't a compromise or a simplification. The fort received first-class armament, naval grade, serious. The firing range was about 20 kilometers. A shell weighed approximately 600 kilograms. 600. That is the weight of 5 adult horses flying through a flat trajectory at the speed of sound. But the gun turrets were only part of the picture. Along the sides of the fort were casemates with smaller caliber guns, 6 inches, 3 inches. They were responsible for close-range defense, in case someone tried to approach directly, plus searchlight installations, plus observation posts, plus a communication system with other forts in the bay. Because Fort Drum was not a loner, it was part of a system. Together with the island fortress of Corregidor to the north, and Forts Hughes and Frank, they formed a single line of defense across the entrance to the bay. Imagine a castle with several towers. That's roughly how it worked. Each fort covered its neighbors, overlapped its sector, and kept its stretch of water under control. And when analysts calculated the entire system as a whole, the numbers were impressive. Any surface ship entering Manila Bay fell under the fire of at least 2 forts simultaneously. Across the entire span of the bay's entrance, there was not a single point, not a single corridor, not a single channel where one could hide from this fire. No surface ship in the world could enter Manila Bay as long as those forts were standing. Not one. It wasn't just a fort. It was an architectural argument, a reinforced concrete point in the debate over who controlled these waters. Military engineers looked at the finished system with undisguised satisfaction. They had built what they set out to build, an impregnable line, a castle at the gates. Only one question remained: who would have to defend it? And someone had to live inside this concrete miracle, too. Stop for a second and imagine one thing. You wake up in the morning. Above you is a concrete ceiling. Around you are concrete walls. Under your feet is a concrete floor. You walk to a porthole and look outside. Water. Water to the very horizon. And silence. Only the wind and the cries of seagulls. Welcome to service at Fort Drum. The fort's garrison in peacetime numbered several hundred people. Officers, enlisted men, technical personnel, gun crews. They all lived inside this concrete hull. in cabins, corridors, and rooms that, in their layout, truly resembled the interior of a ship. Because it was designed by naval architects. And they didn't change their habits. Inside the fort, there was everything necessary for autonomous existence. A power plant, fuel reserves, food warehouses, a medical station, workshops, even a small library. Where else would you go on an isolated post? But comfort is a relative concept. The tropical climate turned life inside the concrete walls into a special trial. In the summer, the temperature inside the rooms rose to exhausting levels. The concrete soaked up the heat and released it slowly, steadily, 24 hours a day. The humidity was such that metal objects became covered in rust faster than they could be cleaned. The ventilation worked, but with the tropics, it only partially coped. The soldiers came up with their own ways to pass the time. Fishing right off the side of the fort. Fish in the bay were plentiful. Amateur competitions. Cards in the evenings. Letters home. Long, detailed ones, because there wasn't much to write about, but they really wanted to. One of the officers, Lieutenant Charles Hopper, regularly sent letters to his family in Ohio. In one of them, he wrote literally the following: "Dear Mom, I'm serving on a ship. It just doesn't go anywhere. The food isn't bad. I miss you." For several weeks, his mother was sure her son was joking. Then she came to visit, and stood silent for a long time, looking at the concrete sides of the fort from the water. Garrison rotations happened regularly. People arrived, served their term, and left. The fort remained, constant, heavy, unperturbed, like a massive stone anchor on the floor of the bay. For many soldiers, this place became strangely like home. The isolation created a special atmosphere, a small community of people who depended on each other and knew it, like the crew of a ship on a long voyage. Only this voyage never ended. The years passed. The world around changed. In Europe, events were thundering that would gradually redraw the entire world map. In the Pacific, tension was felt more and more clearly. Where there used to be silence, completely different notes were now sounding. News reached Fort Drum. They read it, they discussed it, and they returned to their duties. And then came December 1941. December 7th, 1941. Sunday. In Hawaii, dawn had not yet broken when it all began. Thousands of kilometers from Manila Bay, over the quiet harbor of Pearl Harbor, the first planes appeared. What happened next, the whole world knows. The news reached Fort Drum by radio. Imagine this scene. The duty radio operator takes off his headphones. He looks at the paper he has just scribbled on. He stands up. He goes to the commander. He hands over the sheet. The commander reads. He is silent. Then he says quietly, "Declare battle readiness." A few hours later, Japanese planes appeared over the Philippines. Strikes were carried out on airfields, ports, and military installations. Everything happened rapidly, almost simultaneously in several places. This was no accident. It was a carefully planned operation. The Fort Drum garrison took their battle stations. Inside the fort, everything changed in a matter of hours. The library closed. Fishing from the side stopped. Letters home became shorter and rarer. People who were playing cards just yesterday were now sleeping by the guns. The fort was preparing for the very thing it was built for. The Japanese command perfectly understood the strategic importance of Manila Bay. Without control over the bay, there is no control over Manila. Without Manila, the entire Philippine campaign hangs in the air. The forts at the entrance to the bay had to be neutralized. The shelling began. Japanese artillery and aviation worked on the forts methodically. Shells fell into the water near the sides. Pillars of water rose high, fell back, and silence returned. Some hit the concrete walls directly, and they bounced off. This is not a metaphor. The shells from the Japanese guns literally could not penetrate what the American engineers had built 30 years prior. 11 meters of monolithic concrete in the most vulnerable spots. That is not a wall, that is a cliff. A man-made cliff, but a cliff nonetheless. Inside the fort during the shellings, dull thuds, vibration, dust from the ceiling, and silence after every hit. People inside looked at each other. The walls held. The fort fired back. The 14-inch guns worked against Japanese positions and against ships attempting to enter the bay. Every shot, 600 kilograms of metal flying for 20 kilometers. Japanese commanders quickly learned a simple lesson. Do not stray into the Fort Drum firing zone. Weeks passed. The situation in the Philippines worsened. On the Bataan Peninsula, American and Filipino troops were holding back the Japanese offensive, but holding on with their last strength. Supply lines were cut. There were no reinforcements. The promised help never came. Fort Drum watched the events from the water. It fired. It held on. Its walls still stood. But war is about more than just walls. April 1942. Bataan fell. This was not just a military defeat. It was a catastrophe. Tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers were taken prisoner. The peninsula, which had held out for months, first on the last food supplies, then on sheer will and stubbornness, finally broke under continuous pressure. Fort Drum learned about this over the radio, as they had about so much else in recent months. Now, Japanese forces could concentrate on Corregidor, the main fortress island in the bay, the very island that covered the northern flank of the entire defense system. Corregidor was larger, better equipped, and it was where the command was located. General MacArthur had been there, although by that point he had already left the island by order from Washington. Thousands of people remained on Corregidor, and upon them, the full power of Japanese artillery and aviation now descended. Fort Drum continued to fire. Its guns worked in support of Corregidor, against Japanese positions on the shore, and against vessels in the bay. The fort's garrison understood. They were one of the last active elements of the defense. As long as the fort was firing, the bay was not surrendered. But inside the concrete walls, something was accumulating that no amount of concrete could handle. Supplies. That was what decided everything. The fort was designed as an autonomous object, with its own warehouses, its own fuel, its own food supplies. This bought time. But time is not infinite. Every day the garrison consumed what could not be replenished. Shells, fuel, food, medicine. Supply lines were completely cut. Not a single ship could break through to the fort, nor could planes. Fort Drum existed in absolute isolation, like a small island inside a vast war. The people inside knew this, and they continued their duty. On May 6, 1942, Corregidor fell. Commanding General Wainwright issued the order to surrender to all American forces in the Philippines. All of them, including the garrisons of the forts in the bay. A radiogram arrived at Fort Drum. Imagine what it was like to receive such an order. Your walls are standing. Your guns are functional. You haven't lost a single direct engagement. The fort has not been taken, not destroyed, not breached. Technically, you are not defeated. But an order is an order. The fort's commander, Major Lewis Poole, gathered the officers. The conversation was short. The order had been received. It had to be carried out. But carried out the right way. The Japanese side sent parlayers to the fort. A small boat under a white flag approached the sides of the concrete battleship. The negotiations were formal. Terms for the transfer of the facility, the fate of the garrison. The Fort Drum garrison laid down their arms in an organized manner. No panic, no chaos. People who had spent months in isolation under fire came out with dignity. The fort, which was never taken by force, passed from hand to hand in silence. Japanese soldiers stepped inside. What they saw made them stop. Walls without a single breach. Guns in working order. Mechanisms that continued to function as if nothing had happened. The fort had been surrendered, but not destroyed. Not broken. One of the Japanese officers, according to eyewitness accounts, stood for a long time in the main gun compartment. He looked at the turret, at the thickness of the walls, at how it was all designed. Then he turned to the translator and said something brief. The translator was silent for a moment. Then he spoke one word in English. Incredible. The garrison was led away. The fort remained. Now a different flag flew over it, and a completely different chapter of its history began. A chapter its creators certainly never planned. Japanese military engineers spent several days in the fort. They walked the corridors with notebooks and measuring tapes. They measured the thickness of the walls. They studied the turret mechanisms. They descended into the lower tiers where the warehouses and the power plant were located. They climbed to the upper decks, which offered a view of the entire bay. They made notes, many notes. Then they sat down and wrote a detailed technical report. The document went to the headquarters of the Japanese forces in the Philippines. It was read there, passed further. Eventually, it reached several high-ranking officers who were involved in planning fortifications in the occupied territories. The reaction was telling. Japanese military builders by that time were themselves erecting fortifications across the entire Pacific region, on islands, atolls, and in ports. They knew what concrete construction was. They had seen different forts and fortifications. They thought they were difficult to surprise. Fort Drum surprised them. The wall thickness in critical areas, up to 11 meters. A completely autonomous power supply system. A well-thought-out ventilation system that worked even in a tropical climate. Gun turrets installed with such calculation as to cover the maximum firing sector with minimum vulnerability to return fire. And most importantly, after several months of intense shelling, the fort had not received a single critical injury. Not one. In the Japanese engineer's report, there was a phrase that was later quoted several times in different documents. It sounded something like this. This facility represents an outstanding example of fortification art, having no direct analogs in our practice. This was high praise from people who professionally built fortifications and professionally stormed them. The Japanese command made a decision. To use the fort. Not to destroy it, not to abandon it, but to include it in the defense system of Manila Bay under new management. The logic was clear. Why build something new when there is something ready-made and perfectly functioning? The Japanese period of Fort Drum began. A new garrison settled inside. They brought in their own gear, their own supplies, and installed their own communication systems. Japanese soldiers walked the same corridors, slept in the same cabins, and watched the bay from the same observation posts. But a problem arose with the guns. The main turrets with the 14-inch guns had been disabled by the Americans upon surrender. Not completely, but seriously enough that a quick restoration was impossible. Japanese technicians needed time and special equipment to bring them back to working order. Time they had. Equipment they lacked. The work went slowly. Meanwhile, the war in the Pacific began to gradually shift. Midway, Guadalcanal. A slow, painful, but steady turn in the balance of power. The Japanese war machine, which seemed unstoppable in early 1942, began to feel pressure on several fronts at once. By 1944, the situation had changed cardinally. American forces were moving back across the Pacific, island by island, base by base. The Philippines were once again in the focus of the American command. General MacArthur, who had left Corregidor in 1942 with the words, "I shall return," was returning. The Japanese garrison of Fort Drum watched the development of events with growing concern. Supplies became increasingly irregular. American submarines and aviation controlled a larger and larger part of the waters. It was harder and harder to replenish reserves. Communication with the command on shore became less and less reliable. The fort was once again in isolation. Only now, with a different garrison inside. And once again, planes appeared over the bay. Only now, with white stars on their wings, not red circles. The Americans were returning, and they faced a difficult task: what to do with their own fort, which was now working against them. January 1945. American forces landed on Luzon. MacArthur kept his word. He returned. And now his command faced a task that, on paper, looked almost absurd. To win back from the enemy a fortification that the Americans themselves had built, which they themselves had designed, about which they knew everything, or thought they knew. Staff officers spread out the old blueprints of the fort on the table, those very ones from 1909, supplemented by later schemes, intelligence data, and aerial photographs. The task was formulated simply: to neutralize Fort Drum as a combat unit and restore control over the entrance to Manila Bay. A simple formulation, an extremely difficult execution. A direct assault was ruled out immediately.
Not because there weren't enough forces. The American troops by that time had overwhelming superiority in the region, but because it was a senseless path. 11 meters of concrete is 11 meters of concrete. It doesn't matter who is storming or from which side. Bombing from the air, also not an option. The Japanese had proven this in 1941 and 1942. Aerial bombs at that time could not cause critical damage to such a construction. The fort was designed with air attacks in mind. The profile of the superstructure, the angles of the walls, the distribution of critical systems across the lower tiers. Naval artillery, the same story. Japanese battleships had already tried. The result was known. That left thinking outside the box. And someone in MacArthur's staff began to do just that. Officers took the blueprints again. This time they didn't look at the walls or the turrets. They looked at what was inside, at the ventilation system, at the location of hatches and technical openings, at how the internal logistics of the fort were organized. The fort was designed like a ship. That meant it had all the same vulnerabilities as a ship. From the outside, invulnerable. But any ship can be taken out of action from the inside. The plan matured quickly enough. The operation was set for April 1945. Preparation was thorough. All available data on the internal layout of the fort, the location of ventilation shafts, and technical hatches on the upper decks were studied. April 1945. American vessels approached the side of the fort. A group of soldiers climbed onto the upper decks of the fort to where the technical hatches of the ventilation system were located. They worked quickly and methodically. They began pumping fuel into the ventilation shafts. Then, they lit it. What happened inside? The fort hid behind its walls. From the outside, only smoke and fire were visible, coming out of all the openings simultaneously. The concrete hull stood as unperturbed as it always had. The walls did not collapse. The turrets did not fall. But as a combat unit, the fort was neutralized. The operation took several hours. The American vessels pulled away. Once again, silence hung over the bay, broken only by the smell of burning and the quiet splash of water against the concrete sides. Fort Drum fired no more. Manila Bay was open. American ships could enter and leave freely. The strategic objective was achieved. The fort stood in the bay, silent, scorched, just as impenetrable from the outside as ever, and completely empty on the inside. The war for it was over, but its story? Not yet. After the war, Fort Drum was almost forgotten. Not immediately. First, there were official reports, military archives, and brief mentions in dispatches. The fort appeared in documents as a neutralized object, and that said it all. Neutralized, taken out of the game, no longer relevant. The world got busy with reconstruction. People had no time for a concrete island in Manila Bay. The Philippines gained independence in 1946. American military bases in the region gradually changed their status, were transferred, repurposed, or closed. Fort Drum was not transferred or closed. It was simply left behind, to stand, in the bay, as it had always stood. The tropical climate began to do its work, slowly, methodically, without haste. The moist sea air reached where the Japanese shells could not. Metal structures began to rust. Paint peeled. Internal rooms, where people no longer entered, began to fall into decay. But the walls stood. Of course they stood. 11 meters of concrete do not fear time, any more than they feared shells. This is a material that thinks in centuries. While people scurried, fought, recovered, and scurried again, the fort just stood in the water and waited. What it was waiting for is unclear. But there was something majestic in this waiting. In the 1950s and 1960s, the fort was occasionally visited by military historians and journalists. They wrote short articles, took photos, shook their heads,
left. The fort remained. Then came the divers. The underwater part of the fort, what is hidden beneath the surface of the bay, turned out to be a world of its own. Coral growths on the concrete foundations, fish that made their home in the artificial reefs around the structure, flooded lower rooms with the remains of equipment. For divers, it was like a time machine, only a horizontal one, going not up, but down and into the past. Today, Fort Drum stands in Manila Bay, just as it stood 100 years ago. If you look at it from the water, the silhouette has hardly changed. The same flattened sides, the same superstructure in the center, the same angular outlines of the turrets. Rust and time have done their part. The paint is gone, the metal has darkened, and secondary structures have collapsed here and there. But the main part stands, because the main part is concrete, and concrete here is in no hurry. Tourists sometimes sail to the fort on boats. They look from the water, they take pictures, they try to imagine what it was like in 1941, when it was alive, when lights burned inside and mechanisms worked, when the garrison stood watch and the guns were ready for battle. It is difficult to imagine, not because of a lack of imagination, but because the scale of this structure and the scale of its history fit poorly together in one's head. Too large a gap between what it was and what it has become. A concrete battleship, which began as a Spanish rock, which American engineers spent 10 years building, which held out under shelling while a whole military campaign collapsed around it, which changed several garrisons and several flags, and which now stands in the water, silent, rusty, forgotten by most. But not by everyone. There are people who fly to the Philippines specifically to see it. Military historians, fortification researchers, naval history enthusiasts. They arrive in boats, look at these sides and try to find traces of hits on the concrete walls. And they find almost none. Because there are almost no traces. The fort withstood everything thrown at it. And here a question arises that I cannot help but ask aloud. What makes a structure great? Its size? Its cost? The number of years it will stand? Or something else? Something harder to measure in meters and tons. Fort Drum was built by people who thought decades ahead, who solved the problem not in the traditional way, but the right way, who took an inconspicuous rock in the bay and turned it into something that baffled an enemy armed with the most modern technology of their time. This isn't just engineering. It's a certain way of thinking about problems, to set the task honestly, to find an unconventional solution, to build it so it holds. Not for a season or a campaign, but for real. So that 100 years later, someone arrives in a boat, looks at these walls and thinks, now that is work. Fort Drum will never set sail. It will never change its position. It will stand in Manila Bay exactly where it stands now, until the water finally wears it away. And that, considering the quality of the work by American engineers of the early 20th century, will not happen for a very long time. Meanwhile, the sun sets over the bay. The light turns orange, then red. The water changes color, following the sky. And in this light, the silhouette of the concrete battleship looks almost exactly as it did in the 1920s, when the fort was new and full of life. The same outlines, the same immobility, the same silent presence in the middle of the water. A ship that doesn't go anywhere. But one which, if you think about it, has already arrived exactly where it needed to be, and it stayed there forever. This was Fort Drum, the concrete battleship, one of the most unusual military structures in human history. If you want to learn more about forgotten pages of military history, be sure to subscribe to the channel. See ya.